I suppose it's just about time to bring Greg Palast on. Now, 10 years ago, if you can believe it, 10 years ago, Greg and I were down in Florida trying to count the ballots. And I wrote a book about that called Jews for Buchanan, because I was trying to figure out how all these elderly Jewish people ended up voting for an anti-Semite. But I have to tell you, Greg did an even better job because he found out that Katherine Harris rigged the whole thing from the start. And I have this fabulous introduction of Greg Palast. It's one of the great journalists in the world, BBC, Guardian, right, just for everybody doing all this great stuff. And it was really special. But Greg informed me that he brought his own introduction along. And so, Mr. Projector Man, wherever you are, please project Greg's introduction.
America, and we'll take back America, and we'll take back.
Hi, I'm Greg Palast, and what you just saw was a part of one of the reports I do for BBC television in England, where, according to the U.S. media, I've been accused of committing journalism. I didn't need this. Yeah, and I know that Katherine Harris has accused me of being twisted and maniacal, so let's twist. By the way, it's a very sacred night. Tomorrow is a sacred day. September 11th, 9 years ago, my building, it was my office building, by the way, I worked in the World Trade Center, went down. Tonight is also a special night, and I'd like to say happy Eid. It's the end of Ramadan, and I'd like to say happy Eid to my Muslim brothers here. And now get out, because I'm told that if you're within 800 yards of me, it's an insult to any of the survivors of the World Trade attack, including the Muslims that died, that worked with me in that building. By the way, the number of Muslims who died in that attack are 4 times it's the highest concentration of any ethnic group to have died in that attack, 400% of their proportion of the U.S. population. Interesting statistic. By the way, I want to thank, we have giants here tonight, I want to thank the extraordinary John Nichols. I've already taken off my hat to him. I can't do it twice. Jim Hightower. Nice hat, Jim. Senator Feingold. Can we in New York borrow him for, a couple of years? We could use a senator. And the wonderful Daniel Kanoige and his poetry. We need it. And especially, the living spirit of Fighting Bob, Fighting Ed Garvey. Please give it up for Ed. Please give it up for Ed. And I have to say, I have some ideas, especially because it's so close to me personally. There's something to be said for what those people who are objecting to the mosque. I also believe that, Tim McVeigh, who was a white supremacist, and his terrorism killed hundreds of people in Oklahoma City. I don't think we should allow white people into Oklahoma City. It's, come on. Can you imagine the feelings of the people there? At Ground Zero used to be a Lenape Indian territory, and thousands died there when the Europeans came across. I don't think we should have churches there either, then, unless the Lenape agree to it. Now, but the thing is, if a mosque, now think about this. I've been thinking about this a lot. If a mosque is a bad idea near Ground Zero, then we shouldn't have any Muslims near Ground Zero. They should and how do we, But how do we stop them? The answer is you make every Muslim in New York wear a little yellow crescent. I know that the ADL doesn't want the mosque there, so maybe they should take that up, suggest that. Now, they're going to rebuild the World Trade Center. They now call it the Freedom Tower. And it's going to replace what was there, except more. More shops, off-track betting, the OTB counter, TGI Fridays, Victoria's Secret. That's how we're going to honor our dead. By the way, you know what Victoria's Secret is? She's an Islamist. True. I know, I'm an investigative reporter. So anyway, I have an idea. I've been, speaking to my Muslim brothers, and I've suggested, as a kind of compromise, that you, in the spirit of the new Freedom Tower, that you disguise the mosque like like those TGI Fridays and the off-track betting places, and so that where they have, every Friday night I used to go in the World Trade Center and see the guys there at happy hour with the secretary. So you make a mosque, or you pretend it's a place that you can gamble and get into your secretary's panties. See? Or, right? TGI Ramadan. Thank God. Or, high fashion kind of thing, Kate Mosque. One of those, they used to have the Disney shop there too, so we can make it Mickey Mosque, That's how we're honoring the dead. By the way, what's interesting to me is that several new churches have been built near Ground Zero in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Interesting, though, that Nagasaki was not the target. I looked this up. But there were clouds over the original target, so they went to Nagasaki, which had the biggest Christian population in Japan, and the bomb landed right above the largest Christian church in Asia. So you know which side God was on, right? But they've invited, nevertheless, Americans to rebuild those churches at Ground Zero, the real Ground Zero. I got to tell you, I personally don't want a mosque near Ground Zero. I want it in Ground Zero. I want it at the top of the Freedom Tower. And I'll tell you why. Because when it goes down next time, we're all going together. Now, by the way, I wanted to pick up on one thing that Senator Feingold said about the Citizens United case. I know that the senator's worried about Exxon buying our elections and Monsanto buying our elections. Hey, that baby's left the barn, Senator. They already buy those elections. I'm not worried about that. I'm worried about AQ Incorporated, Al-Qaeda Incorporated, which now has the right, for $20 registering in Delaware, to give millions of dollars into a campaign, Sarah. She's the one who says that Muslims go to Ground Zero as long as they shop and not pray, right? Yeah, so it's Al-Qaeda, it's the Chinese oil company, it's the Medellin cartel, Inc. As long as they add Inc. at the end, it's okay for them to give into our campaigns under the Citizens United law. That's one of the things that hasn't been discussed, is the amount of hidden foreign money. And the reason we do allow Exxon as a PAC to give into our elections. It makes me puke, but we allow it. But there's one thing that Exxon must do. It must list all the people who put into the fund, and they must all have something in common. If they're going to put money into an election, they have to be an American election. They have to be Americans. They have to be citizens. What the Republican Party did is say, we don't want no stinking immigrants crossing the border, but they can donate into our campaigns, no problem. Yeah. Oh, God. I showed that film about Chevron. There was a lot of BBC reports. In fact, I have some out. I've compiled some called Palast Investigates, since they won't let the BBC reports into America. It bounced off the electronic Berlin Wall. ABC, by the way, ABC television network is allowed to run under a deal with BBC all of my reports. You know, like the one about Catherine Harris removing black voters from the voter rolls, Chevron, the secret reports from the secret plans for the oil fields of Iraq. I'm not saying we went in for the oil, but, you know, we sure as hell weren't leaving without it. But ABC's actually never run one of my reports. And the price to them is free. They say it's too expensive. And it is. That goes back to the Citizens United case, right? Now, I picked part of that BBC report on Chevron for good reason because of a couple things. Right now, I'm in something called the Amazon Arctic investigation. So that was me in the Amazon, where, by the way, I was really dugout canoe. You know, I was told that's not a setup shot. I'm not, you know, Anderson Cooper wouldn't do that. He couldn't get his makeup man in the canoe. But I have to say that was actually real. I was told that the natives, that the indigenous people, the Kofan, would have a boat waiting for me to take them to their village, right? And so it's in the rainforest, and really it's raining, right? It's pouring down, and we go to the end of an endless track, and I said, so where does the boat show up? And they said, that's your boat, that single log that was dug out. And I could just see, you know, the headline, you know, unknown white reporter found floating face down the Amazon. So I tried to get in. The first thing I did is drop my microphone into the Amazon where it sleeps with the piranhas now. I have a very calm cameraman who didn't mind. But yeah, we went there and listening to those lawyers from Chevron. I give them as much time as they want to tell their case. You know, you didn't get all of it, which was, you know, like what? This is the only country where kids die of leukemia. And they said, you know, you're going to have to prove that it was oil that killed them, and then you're going to have to prove it's our oil. And the guy was like, had a big grin, and you'll never be able to do that. Oh, yes, I will. By the way, 60 Minutes did pick up that story. Once in a while they do, but they wouldn't run the stuff about the secret documents where they said to destroy evidence. No, we don't want to do that. Just like when they picked up my story about how Dan Rather at 60 Minutes, how George Bush got out of the war in Vietnam. Actually, he didn't get out of the war in Vietnam. He became a pilot in the U.S. Air Guard where he protected Texas against Viet Cong attack. And I ran that story on BBC television. 60 Minutes picked it up. Then they ran away from it. So did Dan. You should see his lawsuit. It said, I agreed to be silent in return for a promise to have more time on 60 Minutes. Nice, Dan. It's integrity. We have never withdrawn a word of our story at BBC. Now, but I want to bring up Chevron because I'm investigating the entire oil industry, in part because I want to talk about the company that destroyed the Gulf shore, the Gulf of Mexico. It's named Chevron. Okay, now I'm going to tell you a couple things. Let's tell a couple stories. Number one, I was with the chief lawyer on the BP case when the call came in. We were both in Vegas, actually, playing nickel slots. I kid you not. And the call came into him from the Coast Guard the night of April 20th. And the Coast Guard said that there has been an explosion at a deep water rig, and his clients were found, they believe his clients are in a safety capsule, big giant safety capsule that blew off the rig, where you go inside in case there's a trouble. So it's blast proof, et cetera, and it floats. But no one answered, so they just assumed that the 11 workers, his clients, were cooked alive, and they just wanted his permission to open the capsule to retrieve the corpses. That was my introduction to what happened that night. And then I watched the oil spread. And I said to myself, I've seen this movie before. I've seen this movie before because before as a journalist I had a real job. I was an investigator. And I was in charge of the investigation of fraud in the grounding of the Exxon Valdez, and fraud charges. And as you saw in my little film introducing it, yeah, Exxon can't be let off the hook. They literally turned off the radar. It was the early GPS. Now you get them for $100. That was a $2 million machine. They didn't want to bother figuring out how to make it work. So they turned the radar off. But that's not why the oil hit the beaches. The oil hit the beaches in the Exxon Valdez, destroyed 1,200 miles of coastline because the equipment that was supposed to be there, that stuff that they call boom, the kind of orange skirts you throw it around. It's not rocket science to stop an oil spill or a blowout. You put a bunch of rubber around it, called boom. You take out these sucker ships called skimmers that suck the oil out of the boom, the oil that's been contained in the boom, and that's it. Maybe you light it, that's all. It's not rocket science, okay? Now, when that happened, why did it happen? The ship Exxon Valdez hit on Bligh Reef. It's named after Captain Bligh, really. And right at Bligh Reef, there's a native village. Alaskan natives, the Tatitlik village. The Chief Gary Kompkoff, and Chief Kompkoff told me that they watched the ship come in right towards the village, and they're saying, what the? This must be some weird test. And they literally watched that tanker grind right up onto the reef. And they knew, first of all, that was the end of the ship, of course, and that was the end of the village. Because they lived completely, they're in the middle of nowhere, they lived completely off what they could catch out of that water. And now, the salmon are still back, but your choice is leaded and unleaded. It's still there. Go to Sleepy Bay, go back to Alaska, as I'm going to do in 2 weeks, and you stick your hand in the beach. It looks clean, then you stick your hand in, and pull it up, and there's covered with crude. 20 years later. That's why I'm so thrilled when our Department of Interior Secretary, Mr. Salazar, says, oil's gone. Oil's gone. I'll tell you what, you drink that water, Mr. Salazar, then tell me the oil's gone after you're done vomiting. Okay, now, the tragedy was something else, which is that that boom that I told you about was supposed to be right there on that island, right at Bligh Island, right where the ship hit. There was supposed to be a containment barge that would skim it out and run the stuff around. And there was supposed to be an emergency crew on 24/7 notice. You have what's called an oil response team. It's just like a fire truck. You don't hold big events like this in cities without having a firehouse that's ready to go in case something goes wrong, right? You don't send out oil under the law, under the federal law, unless the oil spill response team is in place. You know what the response team was? The Tatitlik natives. They were hired. They were hired, they were trained to drop from helicopters, lay the boom, take the equipment. It wasn't put out. Now, who was in charge? Exxon's name was in the ship. Who was in charge of putting out that boom? Who fired the natives? They were brought in and hired, as it turns out, just to bust a Teamster union strike. And then once they busted the strike, they fired the natives. Never told the federal government. They told the federal government the natives were still on duty. They took away their equipment too because they were afraid that they were going to steal the rubber boom. And as one native said to me, I eat seal. What am I going to do with a rubber boom? That's what happened. And the company in charge is called Alyeska. Cool name, huh? Alyeska, which is simply the corporate alias for a company called British Petroleum. So the name on the ship was Exxon, but the name on the destruction was BP Inc. And that story has not come out. And so when I saw them do it again, no cruise, no boom. The president waited 5 days. He could have contained it if he did it in 5 hours. He waited 5 days to federalize it because BP, which has to pay when the federal government takes over, said, we'll take care of it. So and oil, it's just like in your kitchen. It just starts spreading, right? By the time the president decided he ought to do something, the slick was bigger than Jamaica, right? I looked at the BP oil response plan. And people make jokes about it because they stole some of the stuff from Alaska. It has walrus protection in it and stuff like that. But the big problem is I was looking for where the rubber boom was. And 600 pages long. And there's like 25 pages on what the public relations response should be. I kid you not, in case of a spill or a blowout. But I looked for where the equipment is. And what they had was one page with telephone numbers, like oil boom is us. Telephone numbers, where they could call and kind of order it takeout, I suppose. That was the plan. So we saw it 20 years ago, and we saw it this past April. It's the same game, it's the same company, it's the same crowd. But why does Chevron come in? I'm going to tell you something. Yes, the Gulf Coast has been absolutely destroyed, but not by BP's oil. Because I saw those pictures. I've investigated down there too. I saw those pictures of Grand Isle looking with all the oil and the dead birds covered in oil in the Cajun area of Louisiana, and everyone was shocked. But I tell you something, if you came there 2 weeks before the spill, you'd have seen the same crappy oil. Grand Isle is always a shithole. I'm telling you straight, caused by the oil companies already. Now, this is why I want to tell you about New Orleans. What? Okay, very important. Predicate. In 1994, there was a hurricane. Federal seawalls were smashed down. It was a failure of the U.S. government. So the U.S. government paid for every home to be rebuilt in 94. That was West Hampton Dunes. Every one of the $3 million mansions was replaced by the federal government for the subprime loan sharks and the B-grade actresses. They got their homes restored. They even trucked in, the U.S. Army Corps even trucked in hundreds of dump trucks filled with sand to restore the beaches. Okay, but that's West Hampton Dunes. Switch to New Orleans. Well, did we replace the homes there? No, you know why? That was, according to President Bush, an act of God. Now, that's strange for a religious man to blame the Lord for what was, in fact, an act of Chevron. And here's why. Every year, Chevron, BP, are the major drillers there. They channel through the swamps to drill. They don't backfill, which they could because that's too expensive. As a result, the Gulf is slowly moving towards New Orleans. People say, why do they have that city there, so near the Gulf, below sea level? Well, when they built that city there, the Gulf was way far away. And the oil companies have brought it closer and closer. Closer and closer. As the hurricane expert Ivor van Heerden said, yeah, for those who know who he is, every day we have a blowout. We lose 250,000 acres a year of the wetlands. So the Gulf was brought by the oil companies right up to the steps of New Orleans. But that wasn't quite enough. See, the oil companies didn't like the fact that they had to take the lazy old Mississippi River up to New Orleans. See, nature, despite what Mr. Bush says, protected New Orleans with the wetlands and with the curves of the slow curves of the Mississippi. Oil companies had a great idea. We could save a day of shipment if instead of going through this windy old miss, we just dig a trench straight out from the Gulf right up to New Orleans, right straight into New Orleans. The Mississippi River Gulf outlet, Mr. Go, okay? If you look at a map, if you look at a satellite map, it looks like a rifle barrel pointed right at New Orleans. And what experts called it before Katrina was the Hurricane Highway. They were waiting for the water, for one hurricane to be aimed just right and shoot a wall of water right up Mr. Go. And that's what happened. At the end of Mr. Go's 9th Ward, you tell me, was that an act of God? Do you want to blame it on the Lord, Mr. Bush? Do you want to blame an act of Chevron, the Army Corps? A judge has ruled this year, just ruled, that the United States government, pushed by the oil companies, is 100% responsible and must rebuild the homes of New Orleans. But when the suit was brought by the people of New Orleans, Bush took the legal position, act of God, not act of us. Now, new president, the Justice Department is saying that this is now Mr. Obama's Justice Department saying they are going to appeal the decision. They are not going to pay the people of New Orleans. Now, it's one thing to take on Mr. Bush's war against the Taliban. But I'm not quite sure why Mr. Obama is taking on Mr. Bush's war against the people of New Orleans. Now, I know that we're seeing this film again. Why don't we know about these things? The answer is because bad things happen to people that take on BP. In the case of the Exxon Valdez spill, there was a whistleblower, a partner of Exxon, an oil man who took the Concorde to London to say, this shipping route is just dangerous. They marked him down, and they followed him. They hired some CIA operatives to follow the whistleblower, a guy named Chuck Hamill. When he went to Washington to speak to Congressman Mitchell about the dangers on the pipeline route, BP tried to bug his conversations with the congressman. He was in a hotel room, and they ran a toy truck with a microphone, remote control, one of those little, radio-controlled toy trucks, with a microphone through the vents over his room. Kid you not, real black ops deal. Unfortunately for British Petroleum, the FBI was also doing a stakeout that day, running their own wires through the vents. And their wires crossed BP's wires. And the FBI assumed that, mobsters were onto them and running their own system, so they kicked in the door. They found out right away where the radio signal is coming from. They kicked in the door, and they see these BP guys, right? So, of course, they did bust them. And a federal judge said that British Petroleum's action was, quote, reminiscent of Nazi Germany. So when you see that wonderful green paint, right? That pukey green, sick leprechaun paint on their stations, it's for the Yankee dollar. Okay? That's what it's about. But they're not the most evil. What happened? So what about BP and Chevron? And I mentioned the name Von Heerden. He was probably the #1 hurricane and wetlands expert in America. Deputy director of the Hurricane Center at Louisiana State University, which closed its hurricane center this year. Can you believe? Last year, Louisiana State closed its hurricane center. Okay, now why'd they do that? Well, Dr. Von Heerden told me that George Bush knew 24 hours before the governor of Louisiana knew that the levees were breaking in New Orleans. Katrina, by the way, never hit New Orleans, just that surge of water up Mr. Go. Katrina went east of New Orleans. They stopped the evacuation. They didn't know the levees were breaking, but the Army Corps did, and they notified the White House. The White House never told Louisiana, because as soon as the federal levees break, it's a federal problem. And the White House did not want to tell the state. And I said, so what does that mean? And von Heerden said to me on camera, bottom line, 2,000 people drowned. So they tried to fire him. They couldn't. So they simply closed the entire hurricane center. But they said, don't worry, we're having a wetlands center, right? We're going to go green, environmental. So they removed Dr. von Heerden, they set up this wonderful wetlands center instead. But it's an odd wetlands center because the people hired there keep saying that oil drilling can be good for the wetlands. Now, the money for the wetlands center came from a group called America's Wetlands. And if you go to their website, it's like, flamingos flying and sunsets and oil rigs. And it has like all these, some environmental sounding groups. And then I look through it. 100% of the money behind America's Wetlands donation to LSU, 100% of the money came from Chevron and BP. 100%. And that's how it is. Tomorrow, I'll talk a little bit more about I don't know what yet. By the way, I have some of my films from BBC in the back. If you want to donate to our investigative fund, I'll sign them. But more important, we got to tell the truth on them. That's why when I was a kid, Bob La Follette was my hero. And so it's a very special thrill for me to be here today. By the way, Madison, Wisconsin is the place where the very first environmental lawsuit was filed, which people thought was completely insane because a lawyer named Victor Yannicone, actually, I was with him last week, he came in and filed a lawsuit here in Madison. And they said against dumping dioxin poisons right into the Great Lakes. And they said, well, who are you filing the suit on behalf of? He says, I'm filing a suit on behalf of animals, nature, and all the people of America who love this place. And they said, you can't do that. And the judge said, this is Wisconsin, I think you can. And they won. They won. So it's very special to be here tonight. And I just want to leave with this thought. I mean, I really, for all the problems and things I've said about our good president, I just don't understand why all these teabaggers are screaming, why they're so upset about having a black Muslim president. After all, the white Christian ones have screwed things up so bad, you'd think you'd want to kind of change, right? Okay. See you tomorrow. We'll change it all.